She ran barefoot through the desert darkness, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other clutching the wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Behind her, torches flickered like demon eyes, and voices called her name, not with love, but with the cold certainty of men who believed God had given them ownership of her body. Eleanor, you cannot escape the divine will. Her father's voice echoed across the Utah wasteland, and she knew that if they caught her, the baby inside her would never belong to itself. This is the story of a woman who chose freedom over faith, and the broken man who taught her that salvation doesn't come from heaven, it comes from standing your ground. Stay with me until the very end of this story and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled across the world. The Woman in the Desert. The desert at night holds no mercy. Eleanor Winters had learned this truth with every barefoot step across the hard-pan earth, each rock that bit into her bleeding feet, each thorn that tore at the hem of her dress. The fabric once white and pure, the color her father demanded all chosen vessels wear, now hung in tatters brown with dust and dark with blood. Her blood, always her blood they wanted. The August moon hung fat and indifferent above the Utah territory, casting long shadows from the scattered Joshua trees that stood like twisted sentinels. She'd been running for hours, though time had become meaningless. There was only the rhythm of her labored breathing, the weight of her 8-month belly pulling her forward and down, and the distant shouts of the men who pursued her, her father's men, the Society of Divine Light. Eleanor, the voice carried across the wasteland, rich and resonant, even at this distance. Abraham Winters had always possessed a preacher's voice, the kind that could fill a tent revival or echo off canyon walls, the kind that could convince desperate people that God spoke directly through him, the kind that had convinced her for 23 years that her body was not her own. She stumbled, catching herself against a boulder that still held the day's punishing heat. Her left hand instinctively went to her belly, feeling the child within shift and turn, disturbed by her mother's terror. Her right hand pressed against the wound in her side, the place where Joshua's knife had found her as she'd fled through her father's compound. Joshua, her father's right hand, the enforcer, the one who carved the symbols into flesh and called it holy. The memory made her retch, but there was nothing left in her stomach. She'd vomited the last of her evening meal miles back when the adrenaline first hit, and her body rebelled against the horror of what she was doing, running from God. That's what they'd call it, running from her sacred purpose. But Eleanor knew the truth now. She'd seen it in Joshua's eyes when he'd brought her the revelation 3 nights ago, the prophecy that said her child must be born under the August moon and sacrificed to bring the rains. She'd seen it in the way his hands lingered on her belly, the way his breath quickened when he described the ritual. There was nothing divine in it, only hunger, only power, and she would die before she let them have her baby. The ground began to slope downward, and she half ran, half slid down an embankment, her dress catching on sagebrush. Behind her, perhaps a mile distant now, she could see the torches bobbing like fireflies. 6 of them. 6 men who believed they were doing the Lord's work. Her feet found a dry creek bed, and she followed it, grateful for the smooth river stones that were gentler than the desert floor. The creek wound between low hills, and for a moment, just a moment, she couldn't see the torches. That's when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the desert night. The low of cattle. Eleanor's heart surged with desperate hope. Cattle meant a ranch. A ranch meant people. People who might not believe that a pregnant woman running through the desert was a sacred vessel escaping divine judgment. She pushed forward, following the sound, her vision beginning to blur at the edges. Blood loss she knew dimly. She'd seen enough slaughtered animals to recognize the signs. The world was starting to telescope sounds, becoming distant and strange. The creek bed opened onto a shallow valley, and there, silhouetted against the stars, she saw it. A fence, rough-hewn posts strung with barbed wire, exactly the kind of boundary that separated civilization from wilderness. She'd made it. Eleanor tried to run, but her legs had become distant, unreliable things. She managed 10 more steps before her knees buckled. She caught the fence post as she fell, the rough wood scraping her palms, and then she was on the ground, the earth cool against her cheek. The baby kicked strong and insistent, and she managed to whisper, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Whether she was apologizing for fleeing, for failing, or for bringing a child into a world so full of cruelty she couldn't say. The darkness at the edges of her vision began to spread inward like water soaking into cloth. She could still hear the cattle somewhere close, could still feel the baby moving inside her, alive and fighting just like its mother. And then through the gathering dark, she heard something else. Footsteps, heavy boots on hard earth, a man's voice low and rough. Christ Almighty. Not her father's men. The cadence was wrong, the accent different. This was a voice carved from whiskey and cigarettes, and years of saying things that didn't need to be pretty. She tried to focus to see who stood above her, but her eyes wouldn't cooperate. Just an impression of height, broad shoulders, the silhouette of a hat against the stars. "Don't, please," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "The baby." "Easy now." The voice was closer, and she felt hands on her, gentle hands, careful hands rolling her onto her back. "Jesus, girl, what happened to you?" She tried to answer, tried to warn him that they were coming, that he needed to hide her, but her mouth wouldn't form the words. The darkness was winning now, pulling her down into its cold embrace. The last thing she felt before consciousness left her was those careful hands lifting her, cradling her against a chest that smelled of leather and wood smoke and something else, something that reminded her of safety, though she couldn't remember what safety felt like anymore. The last thing she heard was that rough voice speaking to someone she couldn't see. "Get the medical kit, and heat water, lots of it." Then the darkness took her completely, and for the first time in years, Eleanor Winters surrendered to something that wasn't pain. Mason Reed hadn't expected to find anything when he'd walked out to check on the fence line, coyotes maybe worrying at his cattle, or one of the posts finally giving way to the desert wind. He sure as hell hadn't expected to find a woman. She was a small thing, couldn't have weighed more than 110 pounds, even with the obvious pregnancy. Her feet were torn to ribbons, her dress soaked with blood, and her skin was the color of ash in the moonlight. But what made Mason's blood run cold was the symbol carved into her exposed belly, visible through a tear in her dress. A cross inside a sun. He'd seen that mark before, years ago, on bodies pulled from a mass grave in Kansas, on survivors who'd been blessed by men who thought God spoke through violence. His hands were shaking as he lifted her, actually shaking, and Mason Reed's hands never shook anymore. Not since Antietam, not since the fire. "Thomas," he shouted toward the ranch house, his voice carrying across the 100 yards of open ground. "Thomas, get out here." The door of the small cabin opened, spilling lamplight into the night. Thomas Blackwood Mason's ranch hand, and the only other soul on this God-forsaken piece of land, emerged at a run. The Ute man was half Mason's age, but twice as quick, and he reached them in seconds. "Holy hell, boss!" Thomas's eyes went wide. "That's... Get the medical kit." Mason cut him off, already striding toward the cabin with the woman in his arms. She felt like a bird, all hollow bones and fragile skin. "And heat water, lots of it. Then ride to town and get Doc Brennan. Town's 4 hours there and back." "I know how far town is, damn it." Mason's voice was sharper than he intended, but the weight in his arms, the weight of a life he might not be able to save, was making everything sharp. "She's bleeding bad, and that baby, just go." Thomas nodded once and disappeared into the barn. Mason heard him saddling Dancer, their fastest horse, as he pushed through the cabin door. The main room was sparse, a table, 2 chairs, a stove, and a bunk against one wall. Mason laid the woman on his own bed in the back room, the only real bedroom in the place. She didn't stir, didn't make a sound, and that scared him more than the blood. He lit 2 more lamps, flooding the room with light. Now he could really see her. She was younger than he'd first thought, early 20s maybe. Dark hair matted with dust and sweat skin that would probably be olive-toned when it wasn't ghost white with shock. And her belly, swollen with life, bore that symbol, not fresh but not old either. Weeks, maybe a month healed. The edges were raised and pink, the work of someone who knew exactly how deep to cut. "Goddamn zealots," Mason muttered, grabbing the medical kit from the shelf. His hands found the familiar items without looking: scissors, bandages, carbolic acid for cleaning wounds. Tools he'd hoped never to use for this kind of injury again. He cut away the dress, working carefully around her belly. The wound in her side was deep, a stab wound, angled upward toward her ribs. Not fatal if he could stop the bleeding and prevent infection. Her feet were shredded, full of thorns and small rocks. She must have run for miles. From what, from whom, but he knew. That symbol told him everything he needed to know. Mason worked quickly, cleaning the wounds with carbolic acid, stitching the one in her side with the careful precision he'd learned during the war. She didn't wake, didn't flinch, and he didn't know if that was a blessing or a curse. The baby moved under his hands as he worked, and he felt a lurch in his chest. Part terror, part something older, something he'd buried 3 years ago with his son. "Not now," he told himself firmly. "Focus." He wrapped her feet in clean bandages, cleaned the dirt and blood from her face and hands, and covered her with his spare blanket. Only then did he allow himself to really look at her face. She was beautiful, not in the delicate way, but in the way of something tempered by fire. Even unconscious, even ravaged by whatever hell she'd fled, there was a strength in the set of her jaw, the shape of her mouth, a mouth that suddenly gasped. Her eyes flew open, dark eyes, wild with terror, and she tried to scramble backward, her hands going instinctively to her belly. "Easy." Mason held up his hands, stepping back from the bed. "Easy, now, you're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you." She stared at him, her breathing rapid and shallow, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for escape. "Where?" Her voice was hoarse, broken. "Where am I?" "My ranch, about 20 miles south of Cedar City." Mason kept his voice low, calm, the way he'd talk to a spooked horse. "You were hurt. You collapsed by my fence. I brought you here." Her eyes went to her belly, her hands moving over it frantically. "The baby is fine, far as I can tell, moving strong." Mason watched her carefully. "But you've lost blood. You need to rest." She looked at him, then really looked at him, and he saw the calculation happening behind those dark eyes, measuring him, judging whether he was safe or just another kind of threat. "The men," she whispered, "the men who were chasing me haven't seen anyone." Mason moved slowly to the window, checking the desert beyond. Nothing but darkness and starlight. How many were there? 6. She struggled to sit up, and Mason moved to help her before thinking better of it. She managed on her own, wincing. 6 men with torches. They were there from the Society of Divine Light. Mason's blood went cold. The Society. It wasn't a question. He knew the name. Knew it the way you know the name of a disease that killed someone you loved. You know them. Her eyes had gone sharp despite the pain. You know what they are. "I know what they claim to be." Mason's voice was flat. "And I know what they really are." She studied him for a long moment, and then her shoulders sagged. Not with relief exactly, but with the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying impossible weight. "They'll come for me," she said. "They'll come for the baby. They think, my father thinks." She stopped, her jaw working. "It doesn't matter what they think. They can't have her." Her. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, sad and fierce at once. "I know it's a girl. I don't know how, but I know." Mason pulled the single chair in the room closer to the bed, sitting down but keeping a respectful distance. "What's your name?" She hesitated, and he saw the war in her eyes. Names had power. Names could be used to find people to bind them. "Eleanor," she finally said. "Eleanor Winters." "Winters?" Mason's jaw tightened. "Abraham Winters is your father." Her eyes widened. "Jan, you know him." "Knew him, long time ago." Mason leaned back, his mind racing through old memories, old files. Before the war ended, before he started the society. "You're military." It wasn't a question. She'd seen something in his face, his bearing, the kind of thing you couldn't hide from someone who'd lived with violence. Was government investigator for a while after, dealt with groups like the society. He met her eyes, groups that hurt people in God's name. Eleanor's hand went to her belly again, to the raised scar of the symbol. "Then you know what they do, what they did to me." "I know." Mason's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "And I know they're not getting near you or that baby. Not while I'm breathing." She stared at him, and for a moment he saw something crack in her carefully held composure. Her eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help me? You don't know me, don't know what I've done, what I was part of. Don't need to." Mason stood, moving to the window again. The desert was still empty, still quiet, but he knew that wouldn't last. "You ran. That's all I need to know. You ran and you fought to protect your baby. That makes you worth protecting." A sound escaped her, something between a laugh and a sob. "That's more than my own father believed." Mason turned back to her, and for the first time he let her see the old anger, the old pain that drove him. "Then your father's a fool and a coward, and when he comes for you, because he will come, he'll learn what it costs to treat a life like it's property." Eleanor wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, and when she looked at him again, there was something new in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. "What's your name?" she asked. "Mason. Mason Reed." "Thank you, Mason Reed." Her voice was steady now, strengthened by resolve. "For picking me up, for bringing me here, for—" She gestured at the bandages, the clean room, the safety of four walls. "For this." "Don't thank me yet." Mason moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. "Rest now. My man Thomas has gone for the doctor. Should be back by dawn. Until then, you're safe." He was almost through the door when her voice stopped him. "Mason." "Yeah, that mark on my belly, you recognized it." He turned back, meeting her eyes. "Yes. You've seen it before on others." "Yes." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Were they alive, the others you saw with this mark?" Mason was quiet for a moment, debating whether truth or mercy was kinder, but she deserved the truth. She'd earned it by surviving. "Some were," he said finally. "Some weren't, but every single one of them fought to get away, just like you. And that fight, that choice to run, that's what kept them alive." She nodded slowly, processing this. Then, did they stay alive, the ones who fought? Mason thought of Kansas, of the graves, of the one woman they'd pulled out breathing, who'd later taken her own life when the nightmares wouldn't stop. "Some did," he said, and left it at that. He pulled the door closed behind him, leaving her to whatever rest she could find. In the main room, he checked his rifle, his pistol, the Winchester over the door, all loaded, all ready. Then he pulled out the old lockbox from under his bunk, the one he hadn't opened in 3 years. Inside were files, reports, photographs, all the evidence he'd gathered on groups like the Society, all the nightmares he'd thought he'd left behind. On top was a photograph, faded now. 2 young men in Union uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning like they owned the world. Mason recognized himself 20 years younger and a lifetime more naive. The other man was Abraham Winters. Mason stared at the photograph for a long moment, at the face of the man who'd once saved his life during a Confederate ambush. The man who'd talked about God's love and mercy and the sacred duty to protect the innocent. "What the hell happened to you, Abraham?" Mason whispered to the image. But he knew. He'd seen it before in other men. War changed you, broke something inside. Some men put themselves back together stronger, others filled the cracks with poison and called it faith. Abraham Winters had clearly chosen poison. A sound from the bedroom made Mason's head snap up, not a scream but a whimper, the kind of sound someone makes when nightmares take hold. He moved to the door, cracking it open. Eleanor was thrashing in the bed, her hands clutching at her belly, her lips moving in silent words. Praying or pleading, he couldn't tell. Mason stepped inside, moving to the bedside. Eleanor, hey, wake up, you're safe, wake up. Her eyes flew open, but she wasn't seeing him. She was seeing whatever horror played behind her eyes. Her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. Don't let them take her, she gasped. Please don't let them take my baby. I'll do anything, Shh. Nobody's taking anyone. Mason carefully took her hand in both of his, grounding her. You're at my ranch. You're safe. The baby's safe. She blinked, and slowly, so slowly, recognition returned to her eyes. She saw him, saw the room, saw safety. I'm sorry, she whispered, but she didn't let go of his hand. I dreamed they caught me. I dreamed Joshua was cutting her out of me while my father watched and smiled. Just a dream. Mason kept his voice steady even as rage burned in his gut at what she'd endured. Just a nightmare. No. Eleanor's grip tightened. It's a memory. That's what Joshua told me would happen. When the moon was right. When the time came for the sacred birth. He described every detail, and my father stood there and called it holy. Mason was quiet for a moment, letting her words settle. Then he said, Your father's going to have to go through me to make good on that threat. And I don't die easy. She looked at him, then really looked at him, and he saw her taking his measure, seeing the scars on his hands, the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes never stopped checking the window. You're a dangerous man, she said. It wasn't a question. When I need to be. Good. She finally released his hand, settling back against the pillow. Because they're dangerous too, and they believe God is on their side. God's got nothing to do with it. Mason moved back to the door. Get some rest. Real rest. I'll keep watch. Mason, he paused. What you said before, about the others with this mark, the ones who survived. Her hand traced the symbol on her belly through the blanket. How did they do it? How did they keep living after? Mason thought of all the survivors he'd known. Thought of his own survival after the fire, after Sarah and the boy. They found something to live for, he said finally. Something bigger than the fear, bigger than the pain. His eyes went to her belly. I'd say you've already found yours. Eleanor's hand curved protectively over her child. Yes, I have. Mason nodded and closed the door, leaving her to her thoughts and her baby and whatever small piece she could claim. Outside, the desert night was beginning to fade toward dawn. Another hour, maybe two, before the sun would rise and burn away the shadows. Before Thomas would return with the doctor. Before Abraham Winters and his men would come looking for what they'd lost. Mason checked the rifle again, worked the action to make sure it was smooth. Then he pulled a chair to the window and sat watching the horizon, waiting. In the bedroom, Eleanor lay awake, her hand on her belly, feeling her daughter move and kick and live. For the first time in months, maybe years, she let herself imagine a future where this baby would grow up free, where she would never know what it meant to be called a vessel instead of a person, where she would never bear the mark her mother carried. The baby kicked strong and insistent, and Eleanor smiled in the darkness. I know, she whispered. I know you're there. And I promise you, little one, I promise you'll never know what I knew. You'll never be what they tried to make me. Outside, the desert held its breath, and Mason Reed, scarred by war and loss, and all the evil he'd seen masquerading as righteousness, kept his vigil. Because some things were worth protecting, some lives were worth defending, and some men needed to learn that God's name wasn't a shield for their cruelty. Dawn was coming, and with it a reckoning. The sun broke over the eastern ridge like a promise Mason wasn't sure the desert could keep. He'd been awake all night watching shadows shift across the scrubland, his rifle across his knees and his mind churning through possibilities he didn't want to consider. Thomas had returned an hour before dawn, Doc Brennan in tow. The old physician had examined Eleanor with practiced efficiency, his weathered hands gentle despite their tremor. Age had taken some of his steadiness, but none of his skill. "She'll live," Brennan had pronounced, washing his hands in the basin. "Baby, too, God willing, but she needs rest, real rest, weeks of it, not days. And she needs to eat proper food, not whatever scraps she's been surviving on." Mason had nodded, relief and worry warring in his chest. Weeks meant Abraham would have time to find her, time to plan, time to bring more men than just 6. Now, with morning fully arrived, Mason stood at his kitchen stove frying eggs and salt pork, while trying to remember the last time he'd cooked for someone besides himself. 3 years, he realized. 3 years since Sarah had stood at this same stove, humming while she made breakfast, their son playing with wooden blocks at her feet. He pushed the memory down the way he always did. The past was a grave he'd learned not to dig up. "Smells good." Mason turned to find Eleanor in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame. She'd managed to put on one of his old shirts. It hung to her knees like a dress, and she'd wrapped her bandaged feet in strips of cloth for padding. "You shouldn't be up." He moved toward her, but she held up a hand. "I've been lying down for 8 hours. I need to move." She made her way slowly to the table, lowering herself into a chair with a grimace. "Besides, I wanted to see daylight. Wanted to see what this place looks like when it's not trying to kill me." Mason plated the food, setting it in front of her, along with a cup of water from the pump. She stared at the meal like it might disappear if she blinked. "When did you last eat?" he asked, sitting across from her with his own plate. 2 days ago, maybe 3. She picked up the fork, her hand shaking slightly. "They were fasting, preparing for the ritual. I wasn't supposed to eat anything impure before the birth." "Starvation isn't purity, it's cruelty." "Yes," she took a bite, closing her eyes as she chewed. "Yes, it is." They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds, the scrape of forks on tin plates and the distant lowing of cattle. Through the window, Mason could see Thomas checking the fence line, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon for trouble. "Your man," Eleanor said, following his gaze. "Thomas, is he?" "Ute, from the Paiute band up north." Mason drained his coffee. "His family was killed during the Walker War. I found him half dead in the desert about 5 years back. He stayed." "You make a habit of finding half-dead people in the desert." "Apparently." The corner of Mason's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Though most of them don't run 20 miles barefoot first." Eleanor looked down at her bandaged feet. "I wasn't thinking about distance, just away, getting away." "You got away," Mason's voice was firm. "That's what matters." She met his eyes, and he saw the question forming before she spoke it. "How did you know my father?" "You said you knew him before the society." Mason had known this conversation was coming, had prepared for it all night, but preparation didn't make it easier. "We served together," he said finally. "During the war, same regiment, same company. Abraham was different then. Good man, brave. He saved my life once during a skirmish near Richmond." Eleanor's hands stilled on her fork. "And after the war?" "After the war, I worked for the government, investigating groups that sprang up in the territories, militias, religious movements, anyone causing trouble or hurting people." Mason stood, moving to the window. Easier to talk when he wasn't looking at her face. "Your father started the society about 8 years ago. Started small, just some families looking for meaning after losing everything in the war. But it grew, changed. By the time I heard about it, there were reports of irregularities." "Irregularities." Her voice was bitter. "Is that what you call it when they brand women like cattle?" "I call it what it is, abuse." Mason turned back to her. "I came to investigate 3 years ago. But your father, he knew I was coming, knew how to hide what he was doing. When I arrived, everyone smiled. Everyone was healthy and happy, said they'd heard rumors about my investigation and wanted to cooperate fully. And you believed them? No. Mason's jaw tightened. But I couldn't prove anything. No one would testify. No one would speak against him, and the territorial governor was putting pressure on me to close the case. Abraham had friends, money influence. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the table. 3 years ago, I would have smiled too, would have told you everything was wonderful, that my father was a prophet, that the society was God's true church on earth. She looked up at him. I believed it, Mason. Every word, every revelation, every punishment. I thought it was all divine. What changed? Her hand went to her belly. Joshua came to me 6 months ago, said God had revealed to him that I was to bear the sacred child, the one who would bring the reins and usher in the new kingdom. At first I was honored, terrified, but honored. Her voice dropped. Then he explained how the child would be conceived, how it was my sacred duty to submit to him because he was the vessel of God's will. Mason's hands clenched into fists. Abraham allowed this, commanded it. Eleanor's eyes were dry, but her voice shook. He held my hands while it happened, told me I was blessed, that my suffering was holy, that any resistance was Satan speaking through my flesh. Jesus Christ. After they marked me, cut this symbol into my skin while I was still bleeding from... She stopped swallowing hard. They said it would protect the child, would sanctify her for the sacrifice to come. Mason crossed the room, crouching beside her chair, so they were eye level. Eleanor, look at me. She did, her dark eyes swimming with unshed tears. What they did to you, he said carefully, what your father allowed, what Joshua did, none of that was holy. None of it was God. It was evil men using God's name to justify their appetites. You understand that? I'm starting to. She wiped at her eyes. But knowing it and feeling it are different things. Part of me still hears my father's voice saying I'm damned, that I've condemned my daughter by running, that we'll both burn for defying the divine plan. The only ones burning will be the men who hurt you. Mason stood, his voice hard with promise. That's a guarantee. A sound outside made them both freeze, hoofbeats coming fast. Thomas's voice rang out sharp with warning. Mason riders coming. Mason was at the gun rack in 3 strides, pulling down the Winchester and checking the load. Eleanor struggled to her feet, her face gone white. It's them, she whispered. It's my father. Get in the back room. Lock the door. Mason moved to the window, peering out. 3 riders still a quarter-mile distant, but coming steady. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe. Mason, now Eleanor. She hesitated for just a moment, then turned and limped toward the bedroom. Mason heard the door close, the bolt slide home. Thomas had positioned himself behind the water trough, his own rifle trained on the approaching riders. Mason stepped out onto the porch, the Winchester held easy in his hands, and waited. The riders slowed as they approached, stopping just beyond the fence line. 2 men flanked the third, the one in the center, the one Mason recognized even after all these years. Abraham Winters sat his horse like a prophet, surveying his kingdom. He'd aged well, his dark hair only touched with gray, his beard full and neatly trimmed. He wore black head to toe with a silver cross hanging against his chest. His eyes, Mason remembered, had once been warm. Now they were cold as river stones. Mason, read. Abraham's voice rolled across the yard, rich and resonant. It's been a long time, my friend. We're not friends, Abraham, haven't been for years. Nevertheless, I'm grateful to see you. Abraham's smile was gentle, practiced. I believe you have something that belongs to me. I have a woman who sought sanctuary. That doesn't belong to you or anyone else. One of the flanking riders, a young man with zealot's eyes and a gun on his hip, spoke up. She's consecrated to the Lord's work. She has no right to refuse her calling. Shut up, Jacob, Abraham said mildly, never taking his eyes off Mason. Mason, please, be reasonable. Eleanor is confused, frightened. The burden of carrying the sacred child has overwhelmed her mortal mind. She needs to come home to be cared for by those who understand her purpose. Her purpose? Mason's voice was flat. That what you're calling rape now, purpose. Abraham's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. I see she's been filling your head with lies. The union between Joshua and Eleanor was blessed, sanctified by divine revelation. There was no force, no violation, only the sacred duty of stop. Mason's voice cracked like a whip. Just stop, Abraham. I know what you are, what you've become. This holy prophet routine might work on desperate people looking for meaning, but I knew you when you were just a scared kid from Ohio who cried after his first battle. I knew you before you decided God spoke through you. For the first time, Abraham's mask slipped. His jaw tightened, his eyes hardening. The war changed me, showed me truths you were too blind to see, showed me that God demands sacrifice, that the weak must serve the strong, that some are chosen to lead and others to be used. Mason cut him off. To be branded and brutalized and told it's holy. Yeah, I've heard this sermon before, from men in Kansas, from the bastard in Colorado who burned down a church full of women who wouldn't submit to his divine authority. They all had the same story, Abraham. They all thought they were special, chosen, until the rope tightened or the bullet found them. Abraham's horse shifted, sensing its rider's tension. I didn't come here to debate theology with you, Mason. I came for my daughter, for the sacred child she carries. They belong with the society. They belong to themselves. She's my blood. Then you should have treated her like a daughter instead of livestock. Mason's voice rose, years of contained fury finally breaking free. You held her down while your creature raped her. You carved her skin like she was meat. You told her the child she carried would be killed in some sick ritual. What kind of father does that, Abraham? What kind of man? The silence that followed was terrible. Even the desert seemed to hold its breath. When Abraham spoke again, his voice was soft, dangerous, the kind of man who understands that individual suffering is nothing compared to the salvation of the many, the kind of man who knows that God's plan requires sacrifice, the kind of man who will do whatever is necessary to Mason. Eleanor's voice came from the doorway behind him. Mason didn't turn, didn't take his eyes off Abraham, but he heard her limping footsteps, felt her presence beside him. Eleanor, I told you to. I know. She stood next to him, one hand on the porch rail for support, the other on her belly. But I need to do this. She looked across the yard at her father, and Mason saw her gathering herself, pulling strength from some deep well he couldn't fathom. Father, she said, her voice clear and steady. I'm not coming back. Abraham's face transformed, softening into an expression of paternal concern that Mason knew was as false as fool's gold. Daughter, sweet Eleanor, I know you're frightened. I know the vessel of the divine feels fragile in your mortal hands, but you must trust. I don't trust you. Her voice cut through his platitudes like a knife. I don't trust Joshua. I don't trust the society. I trusted you for 23 years, and all it brought me was pain. The sacred path requires you to leave me alone. Eleanor's hand tightened on her belly. This child is mine, not Joshua's, not the society's, mine. And I will die before I let you touch her. Abraham's mask cracked, further anger bleeding through. You would damn your immortal soul, condemn that child to a life of sin and degradation outside God's grace. If your God demands I sacrifice my daughter, then your God can go to hell. The words hung in the air, blasphemy and declaration both. Mason saw Abraham's hand move toward his belt, saw the young zealot Jacob reach for his gun, and Mason's Winchester came up in one smooth motion. "Don't!" His voice was ice. "Don't even think about it." Thomas's rifle was also trained on the riders now, and Jacob's hand froze. Abraham raised both hands, palms out his face, settling back into that practiced serenity. "There's no need for violence. We're all civilized men here. Civilized men don't brand women and plan to murder babies." Mason's finger rested on the trigger. "You're going to turn around and ride back to your compound. You're going to stay there. And if I see you or any of your people within 5 miles of this ranch, I'll put a bullet in you myself. That clear enough?" Abraham stared at him for a long moment, and Mason saw the calculation happening behind those cold eyes, saw him weighing options, measuring risks. "This isn't over," Abraham said finally. "She's my daughter. That child is my grandchild. I have rights. You have nothing." Eleanor's voice was steady, final. "You gave up any rights when you let Joshua rape me, when you held me down and carved me open, when you told me my baby would die for your prophecy. You're not my father anymore. You're just a man who hurt me, and I'm done being hurt." Something ugly flickered across Abraham's face, rage perhaps, or wounded pride. But he gathered his reins, his expression smoothing back into that mask of holy patience. "The Lord's will cannot be denied forever, Eleanor. The signs are clear. The prophecy must be fulfilled. If you won't come willingly, then other arrangements will be made." "That sounds like a threat," Mason said quietly. "It's a promise." Abraham turned his horse. "The August moon is waxing. Time grows short. Think carefully about your choices, daughter, about what you're risking for this fleeting rebellion." He rode away, his 2 companions following. They didn't look back. Mason kept the Winchester trained on them until they crested the ridge and disappeared. Only then did he lower the rifle, his hands shaking with adrenaline and rage. "Well," Thomas said, emerging from behind the trough, "that went about as well as a cornered rattlesnake." Eleanor sagged against the porch rail, and Mason was there in an instant, supporting her weight. "I've got you," he said. "Easy now." "I thought I'd be brave," she whispered. "Thought I'd be strong, but seeing him, hearing his voice, it all came back. All the years of believing every word he said. Part of me still wants to obey, still wants to go back and beg forgiveness and stop." Mason guided her back into the house, settling her into the chair. That's what he counted on. That's how men like him work. They get inside your head, young, twist up your thoughts until you can't tell their voice from your own. But you stood up to him. You told him no. That's not weakness, Eleanor. That's the bravest damn thing I've seen in years. She looked up at him, tears finally spilling over. What if he's right? What if I'm damning my daughter? What if he's not right? He's sick, twisted, using God's name to justify his own hunger for power. Mason crouched beside her again. "And your daughter, she's going to grow up free because you were strong enough to run. That's blessing enough for any child." Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Boss, we need to talk about security. Abraham didn't bring enough men to take her by force, but he will next time, and next time he won't announce himself." Mason nodded, standing. "How many men does the society have? Fighting men, not just believers." Eleanor wiped her eyes, thinking, 20, maybe 25. Most are like Jacob, young, zealous, would die for my father without question. But there are others, older men, harder men, Joshua's inner circle. Joshua wasn't with them, Mason noted. "Why, I stabbed him." Eleanor's voice held grim satisfaction. "When I ran, he tried to stop me, and I took his knife and stuck it in his leg. Deep, maybe he's hurt bad enough to slow him down. Or mad enough to come faster." Thomas leaned against the doorframe. "Either way, we can't hold this place against 25 men. Not for long. Then we don't hold it." Mason moved to the locked room, the one he hadn't opened in 3 years. "We prepare, we plan, and when they come, we make them wish they hadn't." Eleanor watched him unlock the door, saw the files and maps and evidence of a life she hadn't known he'd lived. What is all this? My past. Mason began pulling out documents, spreading them on the table. Everything I learned about groups like the Society, their tactics, their weaknesses, how to stop them. Among the papers was the photograph Mason and Abraham young and hopeful and alive. Eleanor picked it up, staring at the two men who'd been friends. He was different, she said softly. Wasn't he before? We all were. Mason didn't look at the photo, couldn't. War does things to men. Some of us break clean, learn to live with the pieces. Others break wrong, fill the cracks with poison. Your father filled his with faith, the dangerous kind, the kind that justifies anything. Eleanor set the photograph down, her hand trembling. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why are you doing this? Really? You don't owe me anything. Don't owe this child anything. You could have turned us away, saved yourself all this trouble. Mason was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the maps and files, seeing patterns and strategies, and all the ways this could go wrong. I had a family once, he said finally. Wife named Sarah, son named Daniel. 3 years ago there was a fire. I was in town investigating a case. By the time I got home... He stopped, his throat working. By the time I got home, there was nothing left but ashes and bone. Mason, I'm sorry, I didn't... The fire was set. His voice was flat dead. By a man I'd been investigating. A preacher who ran a compound up in Montana, called himself the Shepherd of Souls. I'd gotten too close to the truth about what he was doing to the women in his flock. So he sent men to deliver a message. They delivered it well? Eleanor's hand covered her mouth. Oh, God! I killed him. Mason looked at her then, and she saw the abyss in his eyes. Tracked him for 6 months, found him in a church he'd built with money stolen from his followers, shot him in front of his whole congregation. Then I turned myself into the marshal, spent 2 years in prison. You went to prison for killing the man who murdered your family, for killing him in cold blood, in front of witnesses. Mason's smile was bitter. Judge was sympathetic, gave me the minimum sentence. Got out a year ago, came here to die quietly. Thought I was done with all this, done with saving people, done with fighting zealots and false prophets. He looked at her belly, at the child moving beneath her hands. But then you stumbled onto my land, he continued, bleeding and branded and fighting for your baby with everything you had. And I realized I'm not done. Not while men like your father are still hurting people. Not while there are still children who need protecting. Eleanor stood, moving to him with careful steps. She took his hand, scarred and calloused and stained with old violence, and placed it on her belly. The baby kicked against his palm, strong and alive. Thank you, she whispered, son, for not being done, for choosing to fight one more time. Mason felt the life beneath his hand, felt the echo of his own son's movements, and something long dead in his chest stirred painfully. We're going to keep her safe, he said. Both of you, I promise. Promises are dangerous things to make. Then it's a good thing I'm dangerous too. Thomas cleared his throat. Hate to interrupt, but we need a plan. Abraham will be back, probably with more men. We can't just wait here and hope for the best. Mason nodded gently, removing his hand from Eleanor's belly. You're right. Thomas, I need you to ride to Cedar City. Find Marshal Dalton, tell him we have a situation. Tell him Abraham Winters and the Society are planning something violent and we need federal intervention. Dalton's 3 days away if I push hard. Then push hard. Mason turned to Eleanor. How much time do we have? When does this August moon ritual happen? In 5 days. Her voice was quiet. When the moon is full. They believe that's when the child's power is strongest, when the sacrifice will have the most effect. 5 days, Mason calculated quickly. Thomas can get the marshal back here in time if he rides day and night. Meanwhile, we fortify this place, set up defenses, make it costly for Abraham to try anything. And if the marshal doesn't come, Eleanor asked, if he doesn't believe Thomas, If he thinks this is just some domestic dispute not worth federal attention, then we fight." Mason's voice was iron. "And we win, because failure isn't an option." Thomas grabbed his coat, checking his guns. "I'll be back in 3 days with the marshal. You two keep breathing till then." "Thomas." Mason stopped him at the door. "Thank you for all of this. You don't have to." "Yeah, I do." Thomas's smile was quick and fierce. "You saved my life once, gave me a home when I had nothing. This is what family does, boss. We protect each other." He was gone before Mason could respond, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the morning. Eleanor lowered herself back into the chair, exhaustion written across her face. "What do we do now?" Mason began gathering the files, organizing information he hadn't looked at in years. "Now we learn everything we can about your father's plans. You tell me everything you know about the society, their routines, their beliefs, their weaknesses, and we prepare for a siege. You really think he'll come with force, attack his own daughter? I think he'll do whatever his twisted faith tells him to do." Mason met her eyes. "And I think that faith is going to tell him to take you back no matter the cost. We need to be ready." They worked through the afternoon, Eleanor sharing everything she knew about the society, while Mason took notes, made plans, identified vulnerabilities. She spoke of the compound's layout, the guards' routines, Joshua's inner circle, her father's habits, and slowly, painfully, she spoke of her life there, of the isolation, the constant surveillance, the punishments for small infractions, the way questions were met with scripture and doubt was called Satan's whisper. "I was born into it," she said, as the sun began to set. "Never knew anything else. My mother died when I was young, childbirth complications. They said, though, now I wonder if it was something else, something they didn't want to admit." "You think they hurt her?" "I think she tried to leave and they stopped her." Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. "I remember screaming. Remember my father holding me while Joshua was younger, then just one of many enforcers while Joshua dragged my mother somewhere. She never came back." Mason felt rage settle in his bones, cold and permanent. How many others? How many women has he hurt? I don't know, dozens maybe. Women who questioned, women who refused, women who tried to protect their children from the sacred duties. She looked at him. "I'm not special, Mason. I'm just the first one who made it out alive." "Then we make sure you're not the last." Night fell and Mason lit the lamps, checked the locks, loaded every gun in the house. Eleanor watched him work, saw the methodical precision of a man who'd done this before. "You really went to prison," she said, "for killing the man who murdered your family." "Yes." "Do you regret it, killing him?" Mason was quiet for a long time. "I regret that Sarah and Daniel died, regret that I wasn't there to protect them, regret that my work put them in danger." He looked at her. "But killing him, no. Some men forfeit their right to live when they take innocent lives. That's not vengeance, it's justice. My father would say vengeance belongs to God. Your fathers used God as an excuse for long enough. Maybe it's time God got some help." Eleanor smiled despite herself. "You're going to hell, Mason Reed. You know that." "Already been there," wasn't impressed. She laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was so unexpected, so full of life, that Mason found himself smiling too. "There it is," he said. "Proof that they haven't broken you, not completely. They tried." Her smile faded. "God knows they tried, but this baby, she keeps me whole, keeps me fighting." "Good." Mason moved to the window, checking the darkness beyond. "Hold on to that, because the next few days are going to test us both." Eleanor stood wincing as her feet took her weight. "I should sleep. Need my strength." "Take the bed. I'll keep watch out here." "Mason, you can't stay awake for 5 days straight." "I've done worse." She hesitated at the bedroom door. What if they come tonight? What if Abraham doesn't wait? Then they'll find out what it costs to threaten people under my protection. Mason checked his rifle again. Sleep, Eleanor, I've got you. She nodded and disappeared into the bedroom. Mason heard the bolt slide home, heard the creak of the bed as she settled. Alone in the main room, surrounded by files and maps and memories of other battles against other zealots, Mason Reed prepared for war, not the war he'd fought as a young man full of ideals and nation. This was different, personal, a war fought for one woman and one child against a man he'd once called friend. Outside, the desert wind whispered across the scrubland. Somewhere out there, Abraham Winters was planning, praying, preparing to reclaim what he believed God had given him. But Mason had learned long ago that God helps those who help themselves, and he intended to help himself to every advantage he could get. The moon rose, waxing toward full. 5 days left. Mason settled into his chair rifle across his knees and waited for the dawn. 3 days passed like a held breath, each one tighter than the last. Mason taught Eleanor to shoot on the second morning, setting up bottles on the fence posts while the sun climbed toward its merciless peak. She held the pistol awkwardly at first, her hands unused to the weight of it, her pregnant belly making the stance difficult. Feet apart, Mason instructed, standing behind her. Wider, good. Now sight down the barrel. Don't close one eye. Use both. Your target's that middle bottle. She fired, and the recoil nearly knocked her backward. The bullet kicked up dust 3 feet to the left of the bottles. Damn it, she muttered. Again, and don't anticipate the kick. Let it surprise you. She fired 5 more times, missing every shot. Her frustration was palpable, radiating off her in waves. Finally, she lowered the gun, her shoulders sagging. I can't do this. I'm useless. You ran 20 miles through the desert while bleeding and pregnant, Mason said quietly. You stood up to your father. You chose life over obedience. That's not useless. That's strength most people never find. He moved beside her, adjusting her grip. This is just mechanics. Muscle memory. You'll get it. She raised the gun again, and this time when she fired, the middle bottle exploded in a spray of glass. I did it. Her face lit up with surprised joy. Mason, I actually... The next bottle shattered before she finished speaking. Then the next. She was a natural. He realized. Once she understood the principles, her body adapted quickly. Good, he said, trying not to smile at her excitement. Now we practice until you can do it without thinking, until it's instinct. They spent the afternoon shooting until her hands were sore and her ears rang despite the cotton he'd given her. By evening, she could hit 5 bottles out of 6, and Mason felt marginally better about leaving her alone when he had to check the perimeter. That night, as they ate salt pork and beans by lamplight, Eleanor asked the question he'd been dreading. What if Thomas doesn't come back? What if something happened to him or the marshal refuses to help? Mason set down his fork, considering his words carefully. Then we handle it ourselves. But Thomas is smart, capable. If anyone can bring help, it's him. And if Abraham comes before Thomas returns, we hold. Mason met her eyes. Whatever it takes, we hold. She was quiet for a moment, then said, Tell me about them. Your wife and son, if you want to. Mason's first instinct was to deflect, to bury the memory like he'd been doing for 3 years. But something in Eleanor's face, the genuine care there, the understanding of loss, made him reconsider. Sarah was a teacher, he said finally, taught at the schoolhouse in town, smart as a whip, patient as a saint. God knows she needed patience to put up with me. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Daniel was 4 when he died, had his mother's eyes, my stubborn streak. Used to follow me everywhere, asking questions about everything. Why is the sky blue, Papa? Where do the stars go in the daytime? How come horses sleep standing up? He sounds wonderful. He was. Mason's throat tightened. Sarah was pregnant again when they died, maybe 6 weeks along. She hadn't told me yet. I found the letter she'd written tucked in her Bible. She was planning to tell me when I got home from the investigation. Eleanor's hand covered his across the table. Mason, I'm so sorry. The man who killed them, Josiah Crane, called himself the Shepherd of Souls. He didn't even know about them specifically, just sent his men to burn my house as a warning. They didn't know Sarah and Daniel were inside. Didn't know they'd barred the door from the outside, trapping them. His voice had gone flat, emotionless. Sarah tried to break through the window, found her body there, Daniel in her arms. She'd wrapped him in wet blankets, trying to protect him from the smoke. Oh God. When I found Crane 6 months later, he told me it was God's will, that my family's death was divine punishment for interfering with his ministry. He actually smiled when he said it. Smiled. Mason's hands clenched. I shot him in the chest, watched him bleed out on the floor of his church, while his followers screamed. And I'd do it again, Eleanor, every single time. She squeezed his hand tighter. I don't blame you, not even a little. The law did. Judge said I'd committed murder, no matter the provocation. Called it vigilante justice. Mason laughed bitterly. Maybe it was, but it was also the only justice Sarah and Daniel were ever going to get. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of shared grief binding them. Finally, Eleanor spoke. After this is over, after my daughter is safe, do you think you'll ever forgive yourself for not being there to save them? No, Mason said honestly, but maybe I can live with it. Maybe saving you and your baby is the closest I'll get to redemption. That's not fair to yourself. You can't spend your whole life trying to make up for something that wasn't your fault. Watch me. She smiled sadly. You know what Sarah would say if she could see you now, holed up in this cabin, preparing to die, defending a stranger? What? She'd say you were being an idiot, that she didn't die so you could throw your life away on a suicide mission. Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. She'd want you to live, Mason. Really live. Not just exist in this desert waiting for a chance to trade your life for someone else's. You didn't know her. No, but I know what it's like to love someone, to carry them inside you even after they're gone. Her hand moved to her belly. This baby's father, Joshua, he's a monster, but she's still half me, still innocent, still deserving of life, just like you're still deserving of life even though you couldn't save your family. Mason pulled his hand away, standing abruptly. I should check the perimeter. Mason, it's fine, just need some air. He grabbed his rifle and stepped into the night, leaving Eleanor alone with the lamplight and her thoughts. Outside, the desert was cool, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. He walked the fence line, checking for tracks, for signs of disturbance, but really he was just walking away from a conversation that cut too close to the bone. She was right, of course. Sarah would have hated this, would have told him in no uncertain terms that martyrdom wasn't noble, it was selfish. That Daniel needed a father who lived, not one who died trying to even cosmic scores. But Sarah and Daniel were dead, and Eleanor and her baby were alive, and that's all that mattered now. He was checking the north fence when he saw it, a flash of light on the ridge there, and gone in an instant. A signal mirror maybe, or a reflection off glass. Someone was watching. Mason's blood went cold. He backed toward the cabin, slowly keeping his eyes on the ridge, his hand on his rifle. Inside, he found Eleanor cleaning the dinner dishes, her movements careful and domestic. They're out there, he said quietly, watching us. Her hands stilled in the wash basin. How many? Can't tell, but they're not hiding anymore. They want us to know they're there. It's an intimidation tactic. My father used it before when someone defied him. He'd have men watch their house, follow them, make sure they knew the society's eyes were always on them. Usually people broke within a few days and came crawling back. We're not most people. Mason moved to the locked room, pulling out a box of ammunition. How much longer until the full moon? Tomorrow night. Then they'll make their move tomorrow, probably at dawn or dusk when the light's bad and we can't see them coming clearly. Eleanor dried her hands, her face pale but determined. What do? We prepare, board up the windows, move supplies into the bedroom, That'll be our fallback position if they breach the main room. Load every gun, fill every water bucket in case they try fire." He looked at her. "And you stay in that bedroom unless I tell you otherwise. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you protect that baby. Understand? I understand." She moved toward him, placing both hands on his chest. "But Mason, I need you to understand something too. I'm not some fragile thing that needs to be locked away. I can fight. I will fight. For my daughter, for myself, and yes, for you, because you've given me something I thought I'd never have again." "What's that?" "Hope." Her eyes were fierce in the lamplight. "Hope that there are good men in this world. Hope that my daughter can grow up free. Hope that monsters like my father can be stopped. Don't take that away from me by treating me like I'm helpless." Mason was quiet for a long moment, seeing the strength in her, the core of steel that had kept her alive through hell. "All right," he said finally, "we fight together, but if things go bad, if they breach the cabin, you take that baby and you run. There's a root cellar behind the house hidden under brush. You hide there until it's over. And if you don't come for me, then you wait until dawn, then head for Cedar City. Don't stop, don't look back. Find Marshall Dalton, tell him everything." "Mason, promise me, Eleanor, promise me you'll save yourself and that baby if I fall." She hesitated, then nodded. "I promise. If you promise me something in return." "What?" "That you'll try to live. Really try. Not just throw yourself at them like some kind of avenging angel. Sarah and Daniel wouldn't want that. I don't want that." It was the second time she'd invoked Sarah's name, and this time Mason didn't flinch. Instead, he found himself thinking about what Sarah would want, really want. Not martyrdom, not revenge, just life. Messy, complicated, painful life. "I promise," he said. "I'll try." They worked through the night fortifying the cabin. Mason nailed boards across the windows, leaving narrow gaps to shoot through. They moved food, water, medical supplies, and ammunition into the bedroom. He showed Eleanor how to reload the rifles quickly, how to clear a jam, how to make every shot count. As the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern sky, they were as ready as they'd ever be. "Get some rest," Mason told her. "I'll take first watch." "I can't sleep, not now." "Try anyway, you need your strength." She settled on the bed, fully clothed, her hand resting on her belly. Mason sat in the main room, rifle across his knees, watching the windows for movement. The desert was silent, holding its secrets close. An hour passed, then two. The sun rose, burning away the cool of night, and still nothing moved on the ridge. Then, just as Mason was beginning to think he'd imagined the watcher, a sound drifted across the desert. Hoof beats, many of them. He was at the bedroom door in 3 strides. "Eleanor, they're coming." She was up instantly, moving to the window. Together they watched as riders appeared on the ridge, not 6 this time, but at least 15. They sat their horses in a line, silhouetted against the morning sun, a vision of righteous judgment. Abraham Winters rode at their center, and even at this distance Mason could see the cross gleaming on his chest. "So many," Eleanor whispered. "He brought so many. He's making a statement, showing us we can't win." "Can we?" Mason checked his rifle, his pistol, the spare ammunition in his pockets. "We're about to find out." The riders began to descend, moving at a walk, unhurried. They knew they had the numbers, knew they had the advantage. This wasn't an attack, it was an execution. When they were 50 yards from the cabin, Abraham raised his hand and the riders stopped. He dismounted, walking forward alone, his hands spread wide in a gesture of peace. "Mason Reed," he called, "may I approach? I wish to speak before any blood is shed." Mason glanced at Eleanor. She nodded. He opened the door, but kept his rifle ready. "Say your piece from there, Abraham." Abraham stopped at the fence line that practiced serenity on his face. Up close, Mason could see the years had been harder than he'd first thought. There were lines around Abraham's eyes, a tightness to his mouth that spoke of sleepless nights and wearing faith. "This doesn't have to end in violence," Abraham said. "I've come with sufficient force to take what's mine, but I'd prefer to resolve this peacefully. Give me my daughter, give me the sacred child, and you can walk away. No harm, no vengeance, you have my word." "Your word." Mason's laugh was harsh. "The word of a man who held his daughter down while she was raped. The word of a man who plans to murder a baby. Forgive me if I don't find much value there." Abraham's mask slipped just for a moment. Anger flashed in his eyes. "You always were self-righteous, Mason. Always thought you knew better than everyone else. But you don't understand what's at stake. This isn't about one child. It's about salvation, about bringing rain to this God-forsaken desert, about proving that God still speaks to his chosen. God doesn't speak through child murder. The Lord demanded Abraham sacrifice Isaac, demanded Jephthah sacrifice his daughter. The Bible is full of such trials of faith." Abraham's voice took on that preacher's cadence. "Who are you to say what God demands? I'm the man standing between you and that baby. That's all I need to be." Abraham sighed, and for just a moment Mason saw his old friend in there, tired, lost, grasping for meaning in a world that had broken him. "You can't win this, Mason. Even if you kill me, kill all of us, more will come. The society is bigger than this ranch, bigger than you or me. The prophecy will be fulfilled, if not today, then tomorrow. If not with Eleanor, then with another. The divine plan is inevitable. Then let it be inevitable without this woman and this child. She's my daughter, then treat her like one." Mason's voice cracked like thunder. "Love her, protect her, put her needs above your twisted prophecy. That's what fathers do, Abraham. They sacrifice for their children, not the other way around." Abraham's face twisted with something Mason couldn't quite read, pain maybe, or the ghost of doubt. But it was gone in an instant, buried under layers of conviction. "I'll give you one more chance," Abraham said. "Send her out and live. Keep her and die. You have 5 minutes to decide." He turned and walked back to his men, mounting his horse with practiced ease. The rider sat motionless, waiting. Mason closed the door, bolting it. Eleanor stood in the center of the room, her hands on her belly, her face a mask of controlled terror. "He's going to kill you," she said. "He's going to kill you to get to me. Not if I kill him first." "Mason, there are too many. Even if Thomas comes with the marshal, they won't get here in time. This is—" She stopped, her breath catching. "This is my fault. I should never have come here, should never have brought this to your door." Mason crossed to her, taking her shoulders gently. "Listen to me. You did the right thing. Running was right, fighting was right, and whatever happens in the next hour, you keep doing what's right. You protect that baby. You survive, understand?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I don't want you to die for me. And I don't want you and your daughter to live in chains. Seems we're both going to be disappointed." He managed a smile. "Get in the bedroom, lock the door, don't come out until you hear my voice or see the marshal's badge." "Mason, go, now." She hesitated for just a heartbeat, then stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Then she was gone, the bedroom door closing, the bolt sliding home. Mason was alone. He checked his weapons one final time, positioned himself at the window, with the best angle on the riders. 5 minutes, Abraham had said. Mason watched the sun climb higher, watched the desert shimmer with heat, watched the riders sit patient as vultures. 4 minutes. Mason thought of Sarah, of Daniel, of all the lives lost to men who wielded faith like a weapon. Thought of Eleanor in the next room, curled around her unborn daughter, choosing love over obedience. 3 minutes. He thought of Thomas somewhere on the road, riding hard with help that might arrive too late. Thought of the marshal's face when he heard the story, whether he'd believe it or dismiss it as frontier nonsense. 2 minutes. He thought of Abraham, his old friend, twisted by war and grief, into something monstrous. Thought of how many Abrahams there were in the world, using God's name to justify cruelty. 1 minute. Mason Reed settled his rifle against his shoulder, sighted down the barrel at the man who'd once saved his life, and waited for the storm to break. Abraham raised his hand, and the riders moved forward as one. Not charging, not yet, just walking their horses toward the cabin with terrible patience. They fanned out as they came circling the building, cutting off any escape. When they were 30 yards away, Abraham's voice rang out. "Last chance, Mason, send her out, or we burn you both." Mason's answer was a rifle shot that took the hat clean off Abraham's head. The desert exploded into chaos. The riders spurred their horses forward, and Mason fired, each shot precise and deadly. One man went down, then another, but there were too many, and they kept coming. Bullets punched through the boarded windows, showering Mason with splinters. He ducked, reloading, and heard the crash of breaking wood. They were at the door, ramming it with something heavy. The boards held but barely. Mason fired through the door, heard a scream, but the ramming continued. The door was going to give. He retreated to the bedroom door. "Eleanor, the cellar go now." No answer. The bedroom door was still bolted. The front door exploded inward and men poured through. Mason fired until the rifle clicked empty, then drew his pistol. 2 more men down, but there were still so many, and they were inside now, spreading through the cabin like a plague. Mason backed toward the bedroom firing, and that's when he saw him. Joshua. The enforcer limped through the broken door, his leg wrapped in bloody bandages, his face twisted with hate and righteous fury. He held a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other, and when he saw Mason, he smiled. "The Lord has delivered you into my hands," Joshua said, "just as he delivered the woman." "You're going to have to come through me first," Mason replied, sighting down his pistol. "Gladly." They fired at the same instant. Mason felt the bullet punch into his shoulder, spinning him around. His own shot went wide, and then Joshua was on him, the Bible cast aside, hands reaching for Mason's throat. They went down hard, Mason's head cracking against the floor. Joshua's thumbs pressed into his windpipe, and Mason saw stars, saw darkness, saw Sarah and Daniel waiting for him in whatever came next. No, not yet. Mason brought his knee up hard into Joshua's wounded leg. The enforcer screamed, and his grip loosened just enough. Mason bucked, throwing Joshua off, and scrambled for his pistol. Joshua reached it first. He stood over Mason, the gun pointed at his head, breathing hard. Blood soaked his leg and sweat poured down his face, but his eyes were clear. Certain. "Any last words?" Joshua asked. Mason thought of Eleanor in the next room, waiting terrified. Thought of the baby that would never know freedom if he failed. Thought of all the people he'd failed to save, all the lives lost to men like this. "Just one?" Mason said. "Duck." Joshua's eyes widened in confusion. Then Eleanor's pistol roared from the bedroom doorway, and Joshua's head snapped back. He stood for a moment, surprise frozen on his face, then crumpled to the floor. Mason looked up to see Eleanor standing there, her face white as bone, the smoking pistol trembling in her hands. She'd opened the door at the last possible moment, had seen Joshua about to execute Mason, and had made the choice Sarah had never gotten to make. She'd fought back. "I told you," she said, her voice shaking. "I told you I could fight." Mason pushed himself up, blood streaming from his shoulder. "That you did." Outside, the shooting had stopped. Voices called to each other, confused. Their leader was down. Their enforcer was dead, and they didn't know what to do. Then a new sound cut through the chaos. Hoofbeats, many of them. And a voice Mason had been praying to hear. "Federal Marshal, everyone drop your weapons now." Thomas had done it. He'd brought help. Mason staggered to the window and saw them, Marshal Dalton and at least 20 deputies' rifles trained on the society riders. Abraham sat his horse, his face a mask of shock and disbelief, as his men threw down their guns one by one. It was over. Mason turned to Eleanor, who'd slumped against the doorframe, the gun hanging loose in her hand. He crossed to her, taking the pistol gently, then pulling her into a careful embrace. mindful of his wound and her belly. "You saved me," he said. "You saved me first." She was crying now, great racking sobs that shook her whole body. "I killed him. I killed man." "You saved a life, mine, your daughter's, your own. That's not murder, Eleanor, that's survival." Marshal Dalton appeared in the doorway, his weathered face taking in the scene, the dead enforcer Mason's bleeding shoulder, Eleanor's tears. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he muttered. "Thomas said it was bad, but this—" "It's over now," Mason said. "Abraham Winters and the Society of Divine Light. You've got them dead to rights, attempted murder, assault, conspiracy. Take your pick." Dalton nodded to his deputies, who began rounding up the society riders. Abraham didn't resist, just sat his horse like a statue, staring at the cabin where his daughter had chosen death over return. The marshal turned to Eleanor. "Ma'am, I'm going to need your statement, and we'll need Doc Brennan to check you and the baby. But first," he looked at Mason's shoulder, "let's get that wound tended before you bleed out." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Doc Brennan arrived, extracted the bullet from Mason's shoulder, and declared both him and Eleanor miraculously lucky. The deputies hauled away the society riders in chains, loading the dead onto a wagon. Abraham was the last to go. He sat in the back of the marshal's wagon, his hands bound, his eyes fixed on his daughter. "Eleanor," he called. "Daughter, please. I only wanted—" "You wanted power," she cut him off. Her voice was steady now, all tears spent. "You wanted control. You wanted to be special, chosen, important. And you were willing to sacrifice me and my baby to get it. That's not love, Father. That's not faith. That's just evil wearing a cross." Abraham's face crumpled, and for the first time Mason saw real emotion break through grief, shame, the awful recognition of what he'd become. "I'm sorry," Abraham whispered. "God, forgive me, I'm sorry." "I'm not the one you need to apologize to," Eleanor said. "There are dozens of women, dozens of families you've hurt. Apologize to them. Make it right if you can, but don't expect forgiveness from me. Not now, maybe not ever." Marshal Dalton climbed onto the wagon, snapping the reins. As it pulled away, Abraham never took his eyes off his daughter, and Eleanor never looked away. She stood straight, her hand on her belly, and watched her father disappear down the road toward justice. When the wagon was gone, she finally turned to Mason. "It's really over," she said. "Isn't it? It's really over." She nodded slowly, processing this. Then, without warning, her knees buckled. Mason caught her, and that's when he felt it. The wetness soaking her dress, the sudden tension in her body. "The baby!" she gasped. "Mason, the baby's coming." Doc Brennan was halfway to his buggy when Mason's shout brought him running back. The old physician took one look at Eleanor's face, at the way she gripped Mason's arm with white-knuckled desperation, and his weathered features shifted from fatigue to sharp focus. "Get her inside. Now. On the bed." Brennan was already rolling up his sleeves, barking orders at Thomas. "Boil water, clean linens. Every lamp you've got, I need light." Mason lifted Eleanor as gently as his wounded shoulder would allow, carrying her to the bedroom. She was breathing hard, her fingers digging into his shirt. "It's too early," she gasped. "The baby isn't due for another 3 weeks. Mason, what if something's wrong? What if—" "Shh. Doc Brennan's delivered half the babies in this territory. You're in good hands." Mason laid her on the bed, brushing sweat-dampened hair from her forehead. "Just breathe. You've survived everything else. You'll survive this, too." Brennan appeared with his medical bag, Thomas close behind, with an armload of clean sheets. The doctor shooed Mason toward the door with an impatient wave. "Out. This is no place for men who aren't medical professionals." "I'm not leaving her." "Mason!" Eleanor started, but another contraction hit, stealing her breath. When it passed, she looked at him with eyes that held both fear and determination. "He's right. Go. I need to do this part alone." "You shouldn't be alone." "I won't be. Doc Brennan will be here." She managed a weak smile. Besides, you've done your part. You kept me safe long enough to get here. Now I need to bring her into the world. Mason wanted to argue, wanted to stay, but he recognized the look on her face. This was her fight now, her mountain to climb. He'd carried her this far, but the last steps had to be hers. All right, he said quietly, but I'll be right outside that door. You need me. You call. I will. She squeezed his hand once more, then released it. Thank you, Mason, for everything. He stepped into the main room, and Thomas closed the bedroom door behind the doctor. The Ute man looked at Mason's pale face, at the blood still seeping through the bandage on his shoulder, and guided him firmly to a chair. Sit before you fall down, boss. You've lost enough blood for one day. Mason sat, but his eyes never left the bedroom door. From behind it came sounds he tried not to hear. Eleanor's sharp cries, Brennan's calm instructions, the rustle of fabric and slosh of water. Each cry felt like a knife to his chest, bringing back memories he'd buried 3 years deep. Sarah had labored for 12 hours with Daniel. Mason had been there for all of it, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, feeling utterly helpless while she did the impossible work of bringing their son into the world. When Daniel had finally arrived, red-faced and screaming, Sarah had looked at Mason with exhausted triumph and said, "We made a person. Can you believe that we made a whole person?" He'd believed it then, believed in the miracle of it, the simple, impossible fact of new life. Then he'd buried them both, and belief had become the hardest thing in the world. "Boss," Thomas's voice cut through the memory, "you're bleeding through the bandage. Let me rewrap it." Mason looked down to see fresh blood darkening the cloth on his shoulder. He'd barely felt it, too focused on the sounds from the bedroom. Thomas fetched the medical supplies Brennan had left behind and set to work replacing the bandage with practiced efficiency. "You learned this in the army?" Mason asked, more to distract himself than from any real curiosity. "Learned it from necessity. When your people are dying from diseases brought by settlers, you learn medicine or you watch everyone you love disappear." Thomas's hands were gentle despite the bitterness in his voice. "My mother taught me. She was a healer before the sickness took her." "I'm sorry." "That's the thing about sorrow, boss. Everybody's carrying it. Some just hide it better than others." Thomas tied off the bandage. "That woman in there, she's strong. Stronger than most. She'll get through this." "I know she will." Mason's jaw tightened as another cry came from the bedroom. "Doesn't make listening to it any easier." "No," Thomas agreed, "it doesn't." An hour crawled by, each minute stretched thin as wire. Mason paced despite Thomas's protests, unable to sit still, while Eleanor labored beyond that door. The sun climbed higher, turning the cabin into an oven, and still the sounds continued, cries and gasps, and Brennan's steady voice coaching her through each contraction. Mason thought about Abraham riding away in chains toward whatever justice waited. He thought about Joshua lying dead on the cabin floor before the deputies had taken his body. He thought about all the men of the society locked up now, their prophet exposed, their faith shattered. And he thought about the woman in the next room bringing new life into a world that had tried so hard to destroy her. "Mason!" Brennan's voice sharp with urgency. Mason was through the door before Thomas could stop him. The bedroom was a chaos of blood-stained sheets and lamplight. Eleanor lay propped against pillows, her face the color of old parchment, her body trembling with exhaustion. Brennan worked between her legs, his expression grave. "What's wrong?" Mason demanded. "The baby's breech. Turned wrong." Brennan didn't look up, his hands moving with careful precision. "I'm trying to turn her, but Eleanor's too weak. She's been pushing for over an hour and she's got nothing left." Mason moved to the bedside, taking Eleanor's hand. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain and fatigue. "Can't," she whispered. "Mason, I can't do it. Too tired. Too—" "Yes, you can." He gripped her hand tighter. "You ran 20 miles through the desert. You stood up to your father. You shot a man to save my life. This is just one more impossible thing, and you're going to do it because that baby needs you, because you've come too far to quit now. I'm so tired. I know, but you're also the strongest person I've ever met. Mason brushed sweat from her forehead. One more push, that's all. Give me one more push and bring your daughter into this world. Tears streaked down Eleanor's face, but something in his words reached her. She gathered herself, pulling strength from some reserve Mason couldn't fathom. Got her, Brennan said suddenly. The baby's turning. Eleanor, next contraction you push with everything you've got. Understand? She nodded, her breath coming in short gasps. Mason felt the contraction hit, felt her whole body tense, and she screamed a primal sound of effort and pain and fierce determination. That's it. Brennan's voice rose with excitement. Again, push. Eleanor bore down her hand, crushing Mason's, her face contorted with effort. And then, in a rush of blood and fluid and impossible life, the baby came. For a terrible moment there was silence. No cry, no sound at all. Then Brennan slapped the baby's bottom and the cabin filled with the most beautiful sound Mason had ever heard, the outraged wail of a newborn entering the world. It's a girl, Brennan said, his voice rough with emotion. He quickly cleaned the baby, wrapped her in a clean cloth, and placed her on Eleanor's chest. A healthy baby girl. Eleanor stared down at her daughter, her face transformed by wonder and exhaustion and overwhelming love. The baby was tiny, red-faced, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly as she announced her displeasure at the world. Hello, Eleanor whispered, her tears falling onto the baby's wrinkled face. Hello, little one. I'm your mama, and I will never let anyone hurt you. Never. The baby quieted at her voice, turning toward the sound with newborn instinct. Her tiny hand emerged from the cloth, fingers spreading and closing, and Eleanor offered her own finger. The baby gripped it with surprising strength, and Eleanor laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and disbelief. She's perfect, she said. Mason, look at her. She's perfect. Mason looked, and his breath caught in his chest. The baby was indeed perfect, impossibly small, impossibly real, impossibly alive. Her eyes were closed, her features still forming into what they would become, but there was already a person there. A whole separate person who hadn't existed an hour ago, and now would change everything. Yes, he managed. She is. Brennan worked efficiently, delivering the afterbirth, checking Eleanor for tears, cleaning up the worst of the mess. When he was satisfied she was stable, he stepped back, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. You did well, he told Eleanor. Both of you. That was touch and go there for a minute, but you pulled through. He looked at Mason. And you get out of here before you bleed on my patient. Thomas can keep watch. You need rest. Mason started to protest, but Eleanor spoke first. He's right. Go. Rest. I'm safe now. We both are. She looked down at her daughter, still marveling. We're both safe. Mason nodded and stepped toward the door, but paused at the threshold. What are you going to name her? Eleanor considered this, her fingers tracing the baby's tiny features. I don't know yet. I thought I'd have more time to decide. Thought I'd know the moment I saw her, but... She looked up at him. What do you think? You helped bring her into this world. You should have a say. It's not my place. Yes, it is. You're the only reason she's alive. The only reason I'm alive. Eleanor's voice was firm. So tell me, what should I call my daughter? Mason thought of all the names he'd considered for his own unborn child before the fire had stolen that future. Thought of Sarah's favorite names from the baby book she'd kept hidden in her dresser, but none of them felt right for this child born of violence and hope in equal measure. Faith, he said finally. Call her Faith, because you had faith enough to run, to fight, to survive. And because she's proof that faith in the right things, in love, in freedom, in the future, is worth everything. Eleanor looked down at her daughter, testing the names silently. Then she smiled, and it was the first real smile Mason had seen from her since that first night in the desert. "Faith," she repeated. "Yes, that's exactly right." She kissed the baby's forehead. "Hello, Faith. Welcome to the world." Mason left them, then closing the door quietly. In the main room, Thomas had cleaned up the worst of the siege damage, writing furniture and sweeping up broken glass. He looked up as Mason emerged. "The baby, a girl, Faith, she's healthy." Thomas's face split into a rare grin. "Good, that's real good, boss." He gestured to the water basin. "Clean yourself up. You look like you've been through a war." Mason caught his reflection in the small mirror above the basin and had to agree. His face was streaked with dirt and blood, his clothes torn and stained, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He looked like death warmed over. He washed mechanically, the cool water shocking against his skin, and only then did he realize he was shaking, not from fear or pain, but from the simple, overwhelming fact of what had just happened. A baby had been born, in his cabin, in his bed, a new life against all odds, and he'd been part of it. "Boss," Thomas's voice held concern. "You all right?" "I don't know," Mason said honestly. He lowered himself into a chair, his legs suddenly unreliable. "I really don't know." Thomas poured 2 glasses of whiskey from the bottle they kept for special occasions, pressing one into Mason's good hand. "Drink. You've earned it." Mason drank the whiskey, burning away some of the numbness. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. It was, he realized, the same time of day when he'd found Eleanor 3 days ago, a lifetime ago, 3 days that had changed everything. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, settling into the other chair. "The society's broken, the leaders are in custody, but that woman and her baby, they'll need protection, need somewhere safe to go." "They can stay here," Mason said. The words came out without thought, but once spoken, he knew they were right. "As long as they need, as long as they want." "You sure about that? This place is barely big enough for 2 men, let alone a woman and a baby." "Then we'll build more rooms, expand the cabin." Mason looked toward the bedroom door. "She's got nowhere else to go, Thomas. No family that isn't trying to kill her, no money, no resources. She needs help, and He stopped, struggling to name what he felt. "I want to help her, want to see that baby grow up safe." Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right then, we'll make it work." He raised his glass. "To new beginnings, and to the stubborn fool who keeps finding people to save." Mason touched his glass to Thomas's. "To survival, and to the people strong enough to choose it." They drank, and the whiskey settled warm in Mason's chest, loosening something that had been wound tight for 3 years. He thought of Sarah and Daniel, of the family he'd lost, and for the first time the memory didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a memory, painful still but not consuming. Maybe Eleanor had been right. Maybe Sarah would have wanted him to live, really live, instead of just existing in this desert tomb he'd built for himself. Maybe it was time to try. A sound from the bedroom, not pain this time, but laughter, soft and wondering, the kind of laughter that comes from pure joy. Mason stood, moving to the door, and cracked it open just enough to see. Eleanor was sitting up now, cradled in pillows, with Faith nursing at her breast. Doc Brennan had left, probably to give them privacy, and mother and daughter were alone in the lamplight. Eleanor was talking to the baby, her voice low and musical. "You're going to love it here," she was saying. "Uncle Mason is gruff and doesn't smile much, but he's good, so good. He saved us, you and me, gave us a chance when no one else would." She stroked Faith's downy hair. "And when you're bigger, he'll teach you to ride horses and shoot straight and stand up to bullies. He'll teach you that being strong doesn't mean being cruel, that faith, real faith, is about love, not fear." Mason's throat tightened. Uncle Mason. She'd called him Uncle Mason like he was family, like he belonged in this new constellation she and Faith were forming, like he had a place in the world again. He closed the door quietly and returned to his chair. Thomas had poured another round, but Mason waved it off. He wanted to be clear-headed for this, for whatever came next. "You're really going to do this?" Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "Take them in. Raise that baby like she's yours." "Not mine, but under my protection. Yeah, both of them. And when Abraham gets out of prison, when the society regroups, they won't give up on the prophecy boss. Men like that never do. Then we'll be ready." Mason's voice was hard as iron. "And if they come, they'll learn what it costs to threaten this family." "This family?" Thomas repeated, a smile playing at his lips. "3 days ago you were a hermit who barely tolerated my company. Now you've got a family. Life's funny that way. Life's terrifying that way, but yeah, funny too." They sat in companionable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the cabin walls with long shadows. From the bedroom came the soft sounds of a mother, caring for her newborn, gentle murmurs, the rustle of cloth. The tiny mewling cries of an infant, learning to be in the world. Sounds Mason had thought he'd never hear again. Sounds that felt like a promise. The door opened and Eleanor appeared, moving carefully, Faith wrapped in a clean blanket in her arms. Brennan had clearly helped her change into one of Mason's clean shirts, and though she was pale and exhausted, there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Can we sit with you?" she asked. "I don't want to be alone right now. Want Faith to meet her Uncle Mason properly." Mason stood, helping her to the chair, making sure she was comfortable before settling back into his own seat. Eleanor adjusted the blanket so they could see Faith's face, still red and wrinkled, but undeniably human, undeniably there. "She's beautiful," Thomas said softly. "Looks like her mama." "Thank God she doesn't look like her father," Eleanor said, and there was iron beneath the levity. "I don't want her carrying any part of him." "She won't," Mason said firmly. "She'll carry you, your strength, your courage, your refusal to surrender." Eleanor looked down at her daughter, her expression soft with wonder. "Do you think she'll remember any of this? The running, the fear, the violence?" "No, she'll only know what you tell her. And you can tell her the truth, that her mother loved her enough to cross a desert barefoot, that she loved her enough to stand up to evil, that she loved her enough to kill for her." Mason met Eleanor's eyes. "Those are the things Faith will carry, not the trauma, the triumph." A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek. "How do you always know the right thing to say?" "I don't. I'm making this up as I go, same as you." She laughed, and Faith stirred at the sound, her tiny face scrunching in what might have been irritation or might have been gas. Eleanor shifted her and the baby settled again, her miniature fingers curling and uncurling. "I want her to grow up here," Eleanor said quietly, "in this Bauman, on this land. I want her to know the desert not as something that tried to kill us, but as home. Would that be all right with you?" Mason looked at her, this woman who'd crashed into his life like a meteor, who'd reminded him what it meant to fight for something beyond revenge, who'd given him a reason to live instead of just survive. "More than all right," he said. "This is your home now, both of you, for as long as you want it. Forever might be a long time. Then forever it is." Eleanor smiled, and in that moment, Mason saw the future stretching out before them, not the one he'd planned, not the one he'd lost, but a new one, messy and complicated and full of possibility, a future where a baby girl named Faith would grow up free, protected by a mother who'd moved mountains for her and a gunslinger who'd learned to care again, a future where the desert wasn't just a place to hide from the past, but a place to build something new. Outside, the sun touched the horizon, and the sky exploded into colors that had no names. Inside, 3 people and a baby sat together in the lamplight, bound by circumstance and choice, into something that looked remarkably like family. And for the first time in 3 years, Mason Reed felt something he'd thought dead forever: hope. Faith yawned, her tiny mouth opening impossibly wide, and Eleanor laughed again, that sound of pure joy that was becoming familiar. She looked at Mason over her daughter's head. "Thank you," she said simply, "for giving us this chance." "Thank you," Mason replied, "for reminding me why chances matter." Thomas cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotion. "I'll take first watch. You two should rest while the baby's sleeping." He slipped outside, leaving Mason and Eleanor alone with Faith. The baby was drowsing now, her breathing evening out, her features relaxing into the vulnerable openness of infant sleep. "She's going to be trouble," Eleanor predicted. "I can already tell. Strong-willed, stubborn, absolutely certain she's right about everything. Wonder where she gets that from. Her mother's good genes." Eleanor's smile was tired but genuine, and her uncle's terrible influence. Uncle Mason. He tested the title, finding it fit better than he'd expected. "I like the sound of that." "Good, because you're stuck with us now. Fair warning, babies cry a lot, and they don't sleep, and they go through more diapers than seems physically possible. I survived the war. I can survive diapers. We'll see about that." They sat together as the last light faded from the sky and the stars emerged one by one, impossibly bright in the desert darkness. Faith slept on, unaware of the battles fought for her, the lives changed by her arrival, the future opening before her like a flower. And in that quiet moment in a cabin that had been a tomb and was now a home, two broken people began the slow work of healing. Not because the past didn't matter, but because the future mattered more. The days that followed Faith's birth passed in a rhythm Mason had forgotten existed, the rhythm of life building itself from nothing, one small moment at a time. The cabin that had been silent for 3 years, now filled with sounds he'd thought he'd never hear. Again, a baby's cry in the night, a mother's gentle singing, the soft pad of feet across wooden floors in the early morning hours. Marshal Dalton returned on the 3rd day with news that sat heavy in the quiet afternoon air. He found Mason mending the fence while Eleanor rocked Faith on the porch, the baby wrapped against the late summer heat in light cotton. "Abraham's talking," Dalton said, without preamble, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Singing like a canary, actually. Names, dates, locations. Seems killing Joshua broke something in him. He's been up all night writing confessions, telling us about every woman the society hurt, every crime committed in God's name." Mason hammered in another nail, his jaw tight. "Good, they should all hang. Some will, others will get prison, but there's something else you should know." Dalton glanced toward the porch, where Eleanor sat just out of earshot. "Abraham's asking to see her, says he needs to make amends before the trial." "Absolutely not." Mason's voice was flat final. "She doesn't need to see him, doesn't need his apologies or his guilt. She needs peace. That's what I told him, but he's insistent, says he has information she needs to hear. About her mother." Mason's hands stilled on the hammer. Eleanor had mentioned her mother only once in passing, with that hollowness that came from old wounds never properly tended. He looked toward the porch where she sat, her face tilted toward the sun, Faith peaceful in her arms. "I'll ask her," he said finally, "but the choice is hers. And if she says no, you tell Abraham to take his amends to hell with him." Dalton nodded. "Fair enough. Trial's being for 2 weeks from now in Cedar City. You'll both need to testify." "We'll be there." The marshal tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Mason alone with information he didn't want to carry. He finished the fence repair, taking his time, putting off the conversation he knew was coming. But when he finally approached the porch, Eleanor took one look at his face and knew. "What is it?" she asked, her hand automatically moving to shield Faith. Mason told her, watching her expression shift from peace to something harder, more guarded. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert that had almost killed her. "My mother," she finally said. "He said he has information about my mother." "You don't have to go. Whatever he knows, it won't change what happened. Won't bring her back." No, but I've spent 23 years believing she died in childbirth, believing it was God's will, natural causes, just one of those tragedies. Eleanor looked down at Faith, who was watching her mother's face with that intense newborn focus. But if he had her killed, if Joshua dragged her away because she tried to leave, I need to know the truth. Mason sat beside her on the porch step, careful not to jostle the baby. The truth doesn't always set you free, Eleanor. Sometimes it just gives you new chains to carry. Maybe, but I'm tired of living with questions. She turned to him, her dark eyes clear despite the pain in them. Will you come with me when I see him, if that's what you want? It is. I don't think I can face him alone. Not yet. So 3 days later they rode to Cedar City with Faith bundled between them, Thomas staying behind to watch the ranch. The territorial jail was a squat stone building that smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. Abraham waited in a private room. The marshal had arranged his hands shackled to the table, his face gaunt and aged beyond the few days since Mason had last seen him. When Eleanor entered with Faith in her arms, Abraham's composure cracked completely. Tears streamed down his face and his shackled hands reached toward them before falling back to the table. "My daughter," he whispered. "My granddaughter. Oh God, Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I'm so terribly sorry." Eleanor stood in the doorway, her face unreadable. Mason stayed close behind her, ready to leave the moment she asked. But she stepped forward, settling into the chair across from her father, with Faith held protectively against her chest. "Marshal Dalton said you wanted to see me, that you had information about my mother." Abraham flinched at her tone, cold, businesslike, stripped of anything resembling daughterly affection. But he nodded, gathering himself. "Your mother's name was Rebecca Winters. You have her eyes, her strength." He paused, his voice breaking. "She was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I destroyed her. Tell me what happened. The truth this time." Abraham took a shuddering breath. The society wasn't always what it became. In the beginning, it was just families trying to rebuild after the war, trying to find meaning in all the death and destruction. Rebecca believed in it, believed in me. We were happy, or as happy as broken people could be. When did it change? Eleanor's voice was steady, but Mason could see her hands trembling slightly where they cradled Faith. "After you were born, I'd been having visions, I thought, dreams that felt like messages from God. Joshua encouraged them, interpreted them, told me I was chosen to lead people into a new covenant. And I believed him because I wanted to believe, wanted to be special, important, more than just another scarred veteran with nothing to show for his service. And my mother, she questioned it, questioned the visions, questioned Joshua's interpretations, questioned my authority. She said the society was becoming dangerous, that we needed to disband before someone got hurt." Abraham's eyes were distant, seeing the past. "I told her she was weak, that Satan was speaking through her doubt. I increased the restrictions on the women, started the brandings, began preparing for the sacred revelations Joshua kept receiving." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "What happened the day she died? She came to me with you. You were maybe 3 years old, and said she was leaving, taking you and leaving, going back to her family in Missouri. She said if I loved you, if I loved her, I'd let you both go." Abraham's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I told Joshua to stop her, to bring her back, to do whatever was necessary to preserve the society's unity." The silence that followed was terrible. Faith squirmed in Eleanor's arms, sensing her mother's tension, and let out a small cry. Eleanor rocked her automatically, her eyes never leaving her father's face. "What did he do?" she asked, though Mason could tell she already knew. "He took her to the prayer house, told her he would counsel her, help her see reason. When I came to check on them hours later..." Abraham's face crumpled. "She was dead. Joshua said she'd fallen, hit her head. Said it was an accident, God's judgment on her rebellion. And I believed him, chose to believe him because the alternative was admitting I'd killed my wife." "But you knew." Eleanor's voice was ice. Deep down, you knew it wasn't an accident. Yes, I knew, and I buried that knowledge along with her body. Told you she'd died in childbirth with a sibling you'd never meet. Told the society she'd been taken to heaven for her faithfulness. Told myself that her death was necessary for the greater good. Abraham looked at his daughter with hollow eyes. I've been lying for 20 years. To you, to everyone, to myself. Your mother died because I was too proud to admit I was wrong, because I chose power over love. Eleanor sat very still, processing this. Faith had quieted in her arms, sensing the shift in her mother's emotional state. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was soft, but carried the weight of finality. Thank you for telling me, for giving me the truth even though it doesn't change anything. Eleanor, please. Abraham reached across the table, his chains rattling. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. No, I can never make this right. But I need you to know that I loved your mother, love you. That baby you're holding, my granddaughter, she shouldn't have to carry my sins. She won't. Eleanor stood, adjusting Faith in her arms. Because I'm nothing like you. Because I learned from your mistakes what kind of parent never to be. Faith will grow up knowing love isn't control, that faith isn't fear, that family means protection, not possession. What will you tell her about me? Eleanor considered this, looking down at her sleeping daughter. The truth, that her grandfather was a man who let grief twist him into something monstrous, that he hurt people in God's name because it was easier than facing his own pain, that he's the reason she exists, but not the reason she'll thrive. She looked back at Abraham, and maybe if she asks, I'll tell her that at the very end, he finally chose truth over lies. It's not redemption, but it's something. Abraham's shoulders shook with silent sobs. I don't expect you to forgive me. Good, because I don't know if I can. Maybe someday for my own peace, if not for yours. But not today, not soon. Eleanor moved toward the door where Mason waited. Goodbye, Father. I hope prison gives you the time to become the man my mother thought you were. She walked out without looking back. Her head high, her daughter safe in her arms. Mason followed, pausing only to meet Abraham's eyes one final time. You were my friend once, Mason said quietly. Before the war broke us both. I want you to know Sarah would have forgiven you, would have said everyone deserves a chance at redemption, but I'm not Sarah. And if you'd succeeded in taking that baby, in hurting Eleanor, I would have killed you myself and slept just fine. I know, Abraham whispered to her. I'm glad you were there, Mason. Glad she had someone to protect her when I failed so completely. Mason nodded once and left, finding Eleanor outside in the harsh sunlight, tears streaming silently down her face while she rocked Faith. He didn't speak, just stood beside her, a silent presence, while she grieved for the mother she'd lost twice, once to death and once to the truth. Finally, she wiped her eyes and looked at him. Can we go home now? Yeah, Mason said gently. Let's go home. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, punctuated only by Faith's occasional fussing and Eleanor's soft responses. But as they crested the ridge and saw the cabin below, Thomas's smoke rising from the chimney, the repaired fence gleaming in the sun, the desert stretching endlessly, beautiful in all directions, something in Eleanor's posture shifted. Look, Faith, she murmured to the baby. Look at home. Home, not a cage, not a compound, not a place of fear and control, just home. The trial came and went in a blur of testimony and judgment. 23 members of the society were sentenced to various terms, with Abraham receiving 20 years for conspiracy assault and accessory to murder. Joshua's death was ruled justifiable homicide, and Eleanor was officially cleared of any wrongdoing. The society's compound was seized by the territorial government and sold, the proceeds distributed to the victims and their families. Several women came forward with stories similar to Eleanor's, and slowly, painfully, the truth about the Society of Divine Light came into the harsh desert sun, Through it all, Faith grew. By 6 weeks, she was already showing her personality stubborn vocal, with a cry that could wake the dead, and a smile that made all the sleepless nights worthwhile. Eleanor bloomed too, gaining weight, losing the haunted look that had shadowed her eyes, learning to laugh without looking over her shoulder, and Mason found himself doing something he'd thought impossible, living again. Really living, not just surviving. He built an addition onto the cabin, a proper bedroom for Eleanor and Faith, with real windows and a door that locked from the inside at her insistence. He taught Eleanor to ride, to rope cattle, to read the weather in the desert sky. She taught him to hope again, though neither of them spoke of it directly. 2 months after Faith's birth, on a cool October evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. Faith was asleep in Eleanor's arms, finally worn out after a day of energetic wailing. Thomas had ridden to town for supplies, leaving them alone with the quiet and the endless sky. "I got a letter today," Eleanor said, breaking the comfortable silence. "From my mother's family in Missouri. Marshal Dalton tracked them down, told them what happened." "What did they say?" "That they have a place for me if I want it. A home, family support, raising Faith." She was quiet for a moment. "They sent money for train tickets." Mason's chest tightened, but he kept his voice neutral. "That's good. You should have family around, people who knew your mother." "I should," Eleanor agreed, "but I already have family. Here." Mason looked at her, seeing the certainty in her face, and something in him that had been clenched tight for 3 years finally loosened. "You're sure Missouri's got more opportunities? Schools for faith, churches that don't sacrifice babies, actual civilization." Eleanor laughed. "Civilization is overrated. Besides, Faith needs to grow up knowing the desert, needs to know that the thing that almost killed us also saved us in its way, led me to you. I'm just a broken-down rancher with more ghosts than cattle. You're the man who gave us a chance when no one else would, who taught me that strength doesn't require cruelty, who shows my daughter every day what a good man looks like." She shifted Faith gently. "Your family, Mason, the kind you choose, which is the best kind." They sat in silence, watching the sky darken and the first stars emerge. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, and the desert answered with its vast and patient quiet. "I've been thinking," Mason said carefully, "about expanding the ranch, running more cattle, maybe hiring another hand or two, building something that lasts." "That sounds good." "And I've been thinking about Sarah and Daniel, about how they'd want me to live, not just exist." He looked at Eleanor. "I'll always love them, always carry them, but I think I'm ready to stop dying with them, ready to build something new." Eleanor reached over and took his hand, scarred and calloused and stained with old violence, but steady and warm and alive. "I think they'd like that. I think they'd like what you've become." "What's that?" "A father, not by blood but by choice. Faith's going to need that, going to need someone to teach her all the things I can't. How to stand strong, how to fight when necessary, how to be gentle even when the world demands hardness." "I don't know the first thing about raising a daughter." "Neither do I. We'll figure it out together." She squeezed his hand. "That's what family does." Faith stirred in her sleep, making small sounds of contentment. Above them the stars multiplied until the sky was thick with light, and somewhere far away rain clouds were building real rain, the kind that came from meteorology, not prophecy, that would green the desert and fill the arroyos with rushing water, the kind of natural miracle that needed no divine intervention, just patience and time. "Mason," Eleanor's voice was soft. "Do you think it still hurts, the place where they cut me?" He looked at the faint outline of the scar visible through her shirt, the symbol that had marked her as property. "Does it?" She thought about it, her free hand moving to her belly. "Not the way it used to. It's still there, I'll carry it forever, but it doesn't define me anymore. It's just a scar now, Proof I survived. Good, that's how it should be. What about you? Does your shoulder still hurt where Joshua shot you? Mason flexed his shoulder, feeling the pull of healing tissue. Some, but I've had worse. This one came from protecting something worth protecting. That makes it easier to carry. They fell quiet again, and in that silence something shifted. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the gentle inevitability of seasons changing. The past would always be there, would always shape them, but it no longer controlled them. They were building something new from the ruins, not forgetting but growing beyond. A month later the rain came, not the torrential downpour of a flash flood, but a gentle, steady rain that lasted 3 days, soaking deep into the desert earth. Eleanor stood on the porch with Faith, watching the water fall, and her face held an expression Mason had never seen before, pure, uncomplicated joy. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "I've never seen rain like this. The society always said rain only came from sacrifice, from appeasing God's anger. But this is just weather, just nature doing what it does." "Just rain," Mason agreed, stepping beside her. Faith was awake and alert, her eyes wide as she watched the water fall from the sky. No prophecy needed. On the 3rd day of rain, as the clouds finally began to break, something impossible appeared in the eastern sky. A rainbow, not the usual arch, but a rare night rainbow, pale and ghostly, against the storm-dark clouds, visible only because the moon had risen full and bright behind them. Eleanor gasped, pointing it out to Faith, who reached for the light with her tiny hands. "Look, baby girl, look at that, a moonbow. I've never seen one before. Didn't even know they existed." "They're rare," Mason said, his arm coming naturally around Eleanor's shoulders. "My grandmother used to say they were promises. Proof that even in darkness there's beauty, if you know where to look." "I like that." Eleanor leaned into him, and it felt right, natural, like they'd been standing this way for years instead of months. A promise that things can be beautiful, even when they're not perfect. Faith made a happy sound, her attention still fixed on the moonbow, and Eleanor laughed, that sound that had become common in the cabin, that chased away the ghosts better than any exorcism. "You know what I realized," she said. "Right now in this moment I'm not afraid. Not of my father, not of the society, not of the future. For the first time in my entire life, I'm just here, present, alive." "How does it feel?" She turned to look at him, her face illuminated by moonlight and the faint glow of the rainbow. "It feels like freedom. Real freedom, not the kind people promise, but the kind you earn by surviving everything meant to break you." Mason pulled her closer, careful of the baby between them, and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. It was the first time he'd done it, crossing a line they'd been dancing around for weeks, but it felt as natural as breathing. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met," he said quietly. "Sarah would have loved you, would have loved Faith. I wish I could have known her. She'd have taught you to bake bread that didn't taste like saddle leather, would have told you terrible jokes and made Faith laugh before the baby even understood words." Mason smiled at the memory. "She'd have been a hell of a grandmother. She still can be, in the stories we tell, in the lessons we pass down." Eleanor shifted Faith so Mason could see her better. "Look at her watching the moonbow. She has no idea how special this moment is, but she'll carry it somehow. And when she's older, we'll tell her about the night the desert gave us a rainbow, about the rain that came without sacrifice, about the family that built itself from broken pieces. That's a good story to tell. It's our story, and it's not over yet." The moonbow faded as the clouds shifted, but its promise remained written in the greening desert, in the filled water troughs, in the way Faith smiled up at the two people who'd chosen to love her. Abraham Winters had sought miracles through violence and got only tragedy. But here in this small corner of Utah territory, a different kind of miracle was happening, the quiet daily miracle of healing. As autumn deepened into winter, the ranch thrived. Thomas brought home a wife, a Paiute woman named Sarah, which made Mason smile at the universe's sense of humor. The two women became fast friends, and Sarah taught Eleanor traditional crafts while learning ranch management in return. Faith grew strong and healthy, her personality emerging more each day. She had her mother's determination and something of Mason's quiet stubbornness, though neither would admit which trait was whose. By 6 months, she was sitting up, grabbing everything in reach, and generally terrorizing the household with the cheerful tyranny only babies can achieve. One evening in December, as the first snow dusted the desert peaks, Eleanor found Mason in the barn, checking on a pregnant mare. She'd left Faith with Thomas and Sarah, stealing a rare moment alone. "Can I tell you something?" she asked, settling onto a hay bale. "Always. I wrote to my father, to Abraham, in prison." Mason's hands stilled on the horse's mane. "What did you say?" "That I'm not ready to forgive him, maybe never will be, but that I'm trying to understand how pain can twist people into shapes they never meant to become." She picked at the hay. "I told him about Faith, about how she's growing, about how I look at her and can't imagine ever hurting her the way he hurt me. Can't imagine any faith that would demand it." What did he say back? That he doesn't expect forgiveness. That he spends his days trying to undo the damage he caused helping other prisoners, writing to the women he hurt, with apologies that can never be enough. Eleanor looked up at him. He said the only thing that gives him peace is knowing Faith is safe, that his granddaughter will grow up free of the poison he spread. That's something, I suppose. It's not redemption, but it's a start. She stood moving to stand beside him. "I'm not saying I'll ever have a relationship with him. I don't think I can. But carrying all that hate, it was exhausting. Letting some of it go doesn't mean forgiving him. It just means choosing not to let him keep hurting me." Mason put down the brush, turning to face her fully. "You're wise beyond your years. You know that. I'm tired beyond my years. There's a difference." But she smiled. "Though I am learning things, like how to make bread that doesn't taste like saddle leather thanks to Sarah, and how to rope a calf without falling on my face, and how to be happy without waiting for the other shoe to drop. The last one's the hardest. It is. But I have good teachers." She took his hand, and the gesture that had once been hesitant was now familiar. "Mason, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." His chest tightened. "All right. This life we're building, you, me, Faith, Thomas, Sarah, is this what you want, really want? Or are you just going through the motions because it's the right thing to do?" Mason thought about the question, about the honest answer it deserved. He thought about Sarah and Daniel, about the life he'd lost, and the years he'd spent dying slowly in this desert, about the night Eleanor had stumbled onto his land and changed everything. "3 months ago," he said carefully, "I would have told you I was beyond wanting things, that I was just existing until existence stopped. But now," he squeezed her hand, "now I wake up and hear Faith crying and think, that baby needs me. I hear you singing in the kitchen and think, she's happy here. I look at this ranch and think, we're building something, not going through motions, building. So this is what you want. Yes, you, Faith, this life, all of it." He cupped her face gently. "I loved Sarah, loved her with everything I had, and I'll always love her, always carry her, but I'm learning that the heart's bigger than we think, that you can hold old love and new love at the same time without diminishing either." Tears slipped down Eleanor's cheeks. "I was so afraid you were just being kind, just giving us a place to stay, out of obligation. I am being kind, but it's not obligation, it's choice. Every single day I choose this, choose you and Faith and the family we're becoming." She kissed him then, and it was nothing like the chaste kiss she'd given him the day Faith was born. This was full of promise and possibility, and the terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, broken people could build something whole together. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "We're going to make mistakes," he warned. "I don't know how to do this, how to be whatever we're becoming." "Neither do I, but we'll figure it out," she smiled. "That's what we do, figure things out together." They stood in the warm barn surrounded by the smell of hay and horses, and made no grand declarations or promises. They didn't need to. The promises were written in the expansion Mason was building onto the cabin in the way Eleanor had started calling the ranch ours instead of yours, in the way faith lit up when Mason entered the room. The promises were written in survival and choice, in the daily decision to keep building even when the past whispered that nothing good could last. Spring came, turning the desert into a riot of wildflowers, the direct result of winter's gentle rains. Faith celebrated her first birthday with cake that Sarah made and decorations that Eleanor strung with Thomas's help. She took her first steps that day, stumbling from Eleanor's arms into Mason's, and her delighted shriek of triumph made everyone laugh. "She's going to be trouble," Thomas predicted, grinning as Faith immediately tried to walk again and fell on her padded bottom. "Already is," Mason said, scooping her up and tossing her gently in the air. Her laughter was infectious, pure joy with no shadows. "But she's our trouble." "Our trouble," Eleanor echoed, and the word "our" held everything past and present and future, pain and healing and hope. That night, after Faith was asleep and the others had gone to their own quarters, Mason and Eleanor sat on the porch watching the stars. It had become their ritual, this quiet time when they could just be without the demands of ranch or baby or the world. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I'd gone left instead of right that night?" Eleanor asked. "If I'd run a different direction and never found your ranch?" "Sometimes, but then I remember you didn't go left. You came here, and everything that happened after was because you chose to keep fighting, keep surviving." Mason took her hand. "The universe works in mysterious ways, my grandmother used to say. Maybe you were meant to find this place. Maybe, or maybe I just got lucky. I'm the lucky one. You reminded me how to live again." She leaned her head on his shoulder, comfortable and easy. "We're both lucky then, and Faith's the luckiest of all, getting to grow up in a place where love isn't conditional, where she'll never doubt that she's wanted, protected, cherished. She'll never carry the scars you carry." "No," Eleanor agreed, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly where the symbol was hidden beneath her shirt. "But she'll see mine, and when she asks about them, I'll tell her the truth, that sometimes people who claim to love you hurt you, but that real love, the kind you and Thomas and Sarah show every day, real love protects, nurtures, sets you free instead of chaining you down." They sat in companionable silence until Eleanor spoke again, her voice soft with something Mason couldn't quite name. "It doesn't hurt anymore," she said. "The scar, I used to feel it burning even months after it healed, like Joshua had branded me in more than just skin. But now," she pressed her hand to her belly, "now it's just part of my story, the part that led me here, to you, to home." Mason pulled her closer, and she came willingly, fitting against his side like she'd always belonged there. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human pain and human joy alike. But here, on this porch, in this moment, two people who'd survived the unsurvivable had built something the stars couldn't touch, a family forged not in blood or obligation, but in choice and survival, and the stubborn refusal to let darkness win. "Inside too," Eleanor whispered so quietly, Mason almost missed it. "It doesn't hurt inside too." And as the desert night wrapped around them like a blanket, as their daughter slept safe and sound, in the room they'd built for her as the future stretched out full of promise and possibility, Mason Reed understood what redemption really meant. Not erasing the past, not pretending the scars didn't exist, but learning to carry them without letting them define you. learning that survival isn't just about living through the darkness, it's about finding the courage to step into the light on the other side. The moonbow had promised beauty in darkness, and they'd found it. Not because they'd forgotten their pain, but because they'd learned that pain doesn't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes if you're strong enough and lucky enough and stubborn enough to keep fighting, pain is just the beginning of something better.